Well, apreciados amigos y amigas, qué alegría que estemos todos juntos aquí en la Iglesia de Todos los Santos. Dear friends, what a joy it is that we are here together at All Saints Church. Mi nombre es Mike Kinman. My name is Mike Kinman, soy rector. I am the rector. Mi pronombres son él. My pronouns are he, him. Welcome to the forum, those of you who are gathered here and all of you who are watching and participating wherever you are online. We are thrilled today to have Brother Chris McNabb with Episcopal Migration Ministries. And just, I think, Chris, I think you're going to talk to us a little bit about EMM, so I won't go into the history of that. I will give you a little piece of Chris's history. He is an Episcopal priest. He's also a brother. He's a member of the Order of Francis and Clare. He is now on the staff of St. Andrew's in Seattle as the part-time missioner for contemplative ministries. Before that, he served as priest in charge of St. Francis Episcopal Church on Long Island, New York. And before that, he was a curate for, I love this, Caritas, Justice, and Healing at Trinity Church in Princeton, New Jersey. And he's working full-time as the missioner for something called Neighbor to Neighbor, and that's a program of Episcopal Migration Ministries that equips Episcopal churches to welcome and care for asylum seekers. And so he's going to be talking to us about that. And we have our own history here at All Saints Church. Working with refugees. We have the banner out front on the lawn right now of All Saints Church welcomes all refugees, and certainly in this Christmas season when I guess Mary and Joseph were technically internally displaced persons, but soon after Jesus was born they were refugees as they fled to Africa to avoid Herod's wrath. And this is a good time of year to look at this and to learn what is going on in our church. The Episcopal Church is a major player in refugee resettlement, and to maybe begin to dream a little about how All Saints Church can continue to be involved in that. And then I will add this piece, which is when not working, Chris and his, is it still fiance, Anthony? Yes? Mm-hmm. Enjoy hiking with their two dogs, Lucky and Kahlua, or chilling at home with Bun the cat. So now you know a little bit about Chris. And Chris, welcome to All Saints Church. Thank you so much for being with us here this morning.
Well, thank you for the invitation. When I was preparing to begin this work with Episcopal Migration Ministries, I was able to connect with Greg Boyle, the founder of Homeboy Industries, and he said, anyone who is in the same denomination as All Saints is good with me. So if you have Greg Boyle's stamp of approval, y'all are good with me. So it is a joy to be with you all, and thank you for the kind invitation. I want to share my screen real quickly here to give you a little history about Episcopal Migration Ministries and then speak about Neighbor to Neighbor specifically. Can everyone see the presentation okay?
Yep.
All right, I'm assuming yes, and if it's a no, then I'm sure Mike will give me a...
Yeah, we got everything great. Thank you.
All right, perfect. So Neighbor to Neighbor is a program of Episcopal Migration Ministries, and some of you may know some of the facts that I'll be talking about, so for those for whom this is a repeat, I apologize. But refugees under international and U.S. law is a person who's fled their home country and crossed an international border and has been found to have a well-founded fear of persecution. They go through a whole slew of background checks through the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees and then the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program. And they have access to a number of resources when they get here to the States. Asylum seekers have fled their home countries because of persecution or well-founded fear, but they do not have protected status. And so that's what we see a lot at the U.S.-Mexico border, right? Folks who are coming to the U.S.-Mexico border to claim asylum. And quite honestly, our immigration system is overwhelmed, and we're trying to figure out as a country what's the way to handle this influx of asylum seekers in a way that is true to our principles as Americans and as well for us as Christians that resonates with our own call to welcome the stranger. So everyone applying for asylum must show that they've been persecuted or have a well-founded fear of persecution in their home country. And no other form of violence, hardship, or persecution is grounds for being granted asylum in the U.S. Now, I want to speak a little bit about EMM in general before we get into the asylum process. So EMM, prior to 2016, had 31 affiliate offices throughout the country. And after the previous presidential administration, we landed with 11. Now that's because we get funding through the U.S. State Department to resettle refugees. And when that funding dried up, because we just weren't resettling refugees at the same rate, we had to let go a lot of staff, and so we dropped 20 affiliates. Now when when Kabul fell and we began to realize that we were going to be starting to relocate thousands upon thousands of Afghans, we had to staff up very significantly, as did all the other refugee resettlement agencies throughout the country. And so just to give you a sense, in 2020, all 9 refugee resettlement agencies resettled about 18,000 refugees in the year 2020. Right now, we are all 9 refugee resettlement agencies, of which EMM is one. We're resettling 4,000 refugees, 4,000 Afghans a week. So 18,000 for the whole year in 2020, and now we're at 4,000 every week. So the need for places to relocate Afghans is enormous. Now, back to asylum, and it's all going to come together in the end, I promise. The asylum process is lengthy and difficult. It could take between 6 months to several years to complete. The courts currently have a significant backlog of cases. And after filing for asylum seekers can apply to work legally, but no benefits or medical coverage is granted. So asylum seekers come here without any benefits, and until they're granted asylum, which could take many, many years, they have no source of income and no benefits. Those few who are granted asylum then become asylees, and they become eligible for public benefits, SSI, Medicaid, and are able to work legally. Asylees can also apply to have some family members join them in the United States, and a year after being granted asylum, asylees are eligible to apply for a green card. So I work as a missioner for Neighbor to Neighbor. So what is it? Well, Neighbor to Neighbor is a program of EMM that equips congregations to welcome and accompany asylum seekers through a model known as community sponsorship. Community sponsorship, in our context, is we are inviting Episcopal congregations to minister to the needs of asylum seekers and Afghan arrivals. I promised you it would circle back, through a model known as community sponsorship. So it's a unique opportunity for us to welcome a new neighbor into our community. And we ask congregations to sponsor individuals by providing physical, spiritual, and emotional support to a newly arriving neighbor. Now, this is a lot of work, right? As Mike mentioned, you all have participated in sponsoring a family before, and for anyone who's involved, you know it is not an easy lift, and it takes about 5 to 10 people with 2 designated co-chairs of the committee to make this all happen. And that's mostly just in case someone is away on vacation or their grandkids are visiting, the other co-chair can pick up the slack. Now, as I mentioned, Afghan arrivals have complicated refugee resettlement in a way that is really, we haven't seen since in the last 40 years. So there are 2 tracks within Neighbor to Neighbor to respond to the need. So one, you can be matched with an asylum seeker, right? Someone who either comes to the U.S. border at a port of entry, or maybe comes here on his tourist visa and says, "Oh my gosh, I don't feel safe going back to my home country." They claim asylum. Or you can be matched with an Afghan parolee. So amidst the entire Afghan situation with Kabul falling, the Department of Homeland Security issued a process known as humanitarian parole, where they paroled in thousands of Afghans. And those were the planes that we saw, right, leaving the tarmac in Afghanistan. So they were all paroled into this country and then placed on military bases. And from these military bases, right, that's where all our 11 affiliate offices are relocating the Afghans throughout the country. what's happening is there are so many Afghans, and the military bases are not equipped to handle the winter that is upon us. And so the U.S. State Department instituted a thing called sponsorship circles. And so EMM is becoming a sponsorship umbrella, and local congregations can serve as a sponsor circle. So a sponsor circle is 5 to 10 people who say, yep, we are going to do the work of relocating an Afghan family, and then EMM supports you in that work. And that is considered track 2 of neighbor to neighbor. And based on the needs at the time, the neighbor to neighbor missioner will determine which program best fits the congregation's circumstances, because the reality is the needs are changing so quickly within this work that one week we may think, yep, we have an Afghan arriving to Seattle or to Austin, Texas, or to Miami, Florida, and then everything changes, and all of a sudden we have a Honduran family who needs sponsorship. And so that's why we have to sort of be nimble and always on our toes, ready to react to what is going on at the time. So if this is a good fit for your congregation, or perhaps for another congregation that you might know about, there's my email. I'm happy to talk about neighbor to neighbor. Or if you just have questions in general about EMM and the work that's going on now, I want to open the floor up for questions and hopefully do my best to answer the good questions you all have.
Okay, thanks. Actually, I just love, we'll see you there. Can you just talk, before we get into questions, and I've got a few, and then I can open it up to the community here. And if you're watching us and participating online, you can text your questions in. Let me get you that number. I should have had it up. That number is, hold on, open settings. Excuse me. That number is, he says, I'm sorry. Well, anyway, I'll ask the question of you while I'm figuring out the text number. Can you talk about how you got into this work and what drew you into this, and sort of what made this capture your heart?
Totally. So my freshman year of college, my roommate was a lost boy from the Sudan, so a refugee who fled the civil war in Sudan, and he actually gave me the cross that hangs over my shoulder here as a gift, which was quite intimidating in our college dorm room whenever friends came to visit. But it was really his story and his journey that got me, kind of piqued my interest, and then that summer, on a service trip with my college, we went to the U.S.-Mexico border. We flew into San Diego, and then from San Diego drove down to Tijuana, and I began seeing the disparity that existed. And I grew up in a pretty conservative suburban town outside of Philadelphia, and had a certain understanding of what immigration was. And then over time learned that, well, actually, it's a lot more complicated than that. And so what I've come to realize is that we can fix our immigration situation, and that sadly immigrants have become a pawn, and that go back and forth, right, between whatever politician thinks it's most convenient. And I began to realize that for me, this was where God was inviting me to do ministry, that God was dwelling here, and I needed to find a way to get into this work and to do this work. And so I started as a volunteer with EMM and created a thing called the Immigration Detention Network. It's a network on asylum and detention ministry where we are working to build a nationwide network of resources to help individuals who are caught up in our immigration system, whether seeking asylum or through immigration detention. And then this opportunity presented itself, and I jumped at it. So.
The immigration detention, we have an immigration task force here at All Saints Church, and we do work with local agencies, and we also are fairly strong advocates for the complete defunding of ICE and a complete revamping of the system. So if there's ways that we could be connected with other congregations or institutions who are doing this work, would love to do that. Not to go off on a tangent, but I'm just curious because I was blessed to be able to spend some time in South Sudan in a companion relationship with my previous diocese. I was in Louis. Where was your roommate from?
It's a good question. So he's a member of the Dinka tribe.
Okay.
Yeah.
This was Moru, and Moru and Dinka did not get along when I was there.
Right.
So, yeah.
Complicated times.
Yeah.
And I should mention that Thomas Diaz, who I think is on staff there, he's also a member of the network that I was talking about.
Well then, Thomas, we will just, there we go. Just, so first of all, if you have a question you want to text in, our text number is 910-TEXT-ASC, which is 910-839-8272, 910-839-8272. I was looking, so you said how many refugees were resettled by the U.S. government so far this year?
So we don't have a number for this year, for 2021, but we're at 4,000 a week of relocating Afghans.
Right, which is a lot to, in terms of a strain on a system. I was actually looking up some statistics from the World Economic Forum, and I was astounded by the scope of this problem worldwide. And these are 2017 statistics, but said there are 68.5 million forcibly displaced people worldwide. And of that, 40 million is what's internally displaced, which is you're displaced in your own country. 25.4 million refugees, and then 3.1 million asylum seekers. So, and not all of these are seeking refuge in the United States, and yet the scope of this problem is so incredible. And have you all talked about also? You said there were, with asylum seekers, there is a very narrow range of reasons that you can apply for asylum. Does EMM only do refugee resettlement with people who are seeking asylum and granted asylum? We're getting more and more, not just economic refugees, but climate refugees.
Absolutely.
Can you talk a little about that? Does EMM work with that at all?
Totally. So a few things that are helpful distinctions. So as I was mentioning earlier, a refugee is someone who comes through the official process that's endorsed by the State Department, and they get a bunch of funding that is unique to them as refugees, that they actually do have to pay back within a certain number of years. So EMM has traditionally worked with refugees as a refugee resettlement agency. A number of years ago, there was an attempt to sort of wake the Episcopal Church up, because I think a lot of Episcopalians don't know that this work is happening on their behalf. And so there was a church engagement unit was created, which Allison Duvall heads up. Then I work for Allison in that work. And so from that, Neighbor to Neighbor was created to respond directly to asylum seekers who, for us, right, as humans, everyone's a migrant who's seeking a better home, a place to belong, a place to be safe. And so, but for the purposes of the U.S. law, an asylum seeker has very few rights and very few benefits in this country. And so there was a woman named Christina Rathbone, who was a priest who worked at the U.S.-Mexico border with asylum seekers, and recognized that we had all these Episcopalians, right, who have great hearts and want to do good in the world, and they didn't have a mechanism to do it. And so we created Neighbor to Neighbor, where we train up congregations to do the work of sponsorship. And so Neighbor to Neighbor works directly with asylum seekers, and then EMM, of which, right, we're a larger overarching organization, does the State Department funded work of resettling refugees. Amidst all of that description, Mike, I'll admit I forgot your question. So do you mind repeating it?
I was wondering, to sort of what degree do we work with people who do not qualify? So you sort of did answer the question. Do not qualify for the asylum process, because there's a very narrow range of why you can apply for asylum, right, but are economic refugees or climate refugees or things like that.
Totally. So we're beginning to realize that we are going to have one migration crisis after another. And so one of the things we recognized amidst the Afghanistan crisis, right, we had thousands of Haitians who came to the U.S.-Mexico border. You may recall, right, there were those dramatic images of Border Patrol agents chasing them down on horseback. It was really a very challenging time. And so I was asked by a number of bishops to say, what are we doing to respond to the Haitian crisis? And the reality is that the way our immigration system is set up, unless they come and claim asylum, we don't have a lot of ways to access that. And so we're working with that's part of the reason we wanted to create the network that Thomas Diaz is a member of, because we wanted to respond directly to the needs of people at the border, as well as folks in immigration detention. And so we are working to grow that effort. And so if you're interested in joining the network, please reach out to Thomas and he'll connect you to me. And, we would love for churches to engage as neighbor-to-neighbor congregations, because that's the way that we can start having that impact directly. So we will likely begin seeing more and more climate refugees, more and more folks who come to the border for economic reasons, as well as to escape violence throughout the world. But as of now, international law and the U.S. law is very clear about what can and can't qualify for asylum, and it's very hard for us, right? Because we want to help as many people as we can, but our resources are very limited, and so we keep fundraising and trying to do the best we can to build our capacity. But the reality is we now do the work of about 5 people with a staff of 3.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you're part-time in this, right? Because I see you have another job.
Correct. So that was the hope, but now I'm sort of doing a full-time job and a part-time job, not on purpose, but we thought that this work was going to be 25, 30 hours a week, and then I had the part-time job at St. Andrews. But once the Afghanistan crisis hit, I was actually driving my little RV trailer across the United States to Seattle when Kabul fell, and my boss called me and said, "We have a problem. Yeah. We need you to work while you're driving." So I was driving and, trying to sort of make phone calls and do what we could to begin building the framework of what eventually, became our track 1 and track 2 response from neighbor to neighbor.
Yeah. So, and I got a couple questions and texts are coming in, and I want to see, Thomas, do you want to grab a microphone here and see if does anyone here have a question? Because I can talk forever. So I'll just keep going. The first is, so I want to be clear, so neighbor to neighbor is is it for both asylum seekers and Afghan refugees?
Correct, yep.
So
Afghan parolees.
What does that word mean, parolee?
Totally. So Afghans are coming into the country through 3 separate ways. Either as a refugee, process that would have begun years ago, as a special immigrant visa holder, an SIV, or as a humanitarian parolee. The majority of individuals who came here that we saw evacuating on the planes from the capital of Afghanistan, they were folks who are humanitarian parolees, meaning they were paroled in by the Department of Homeland Security. It's a system that the Department of Homeland Security can activate in times of crisis when, to be honest, people can't wait. They don't have the time to wait for our immigration system, the wheels of it, to turn. And if we don't evacuate people immediately, they will die. Right. And so we recognized that the Taliban was going to begin killing people, and that we had to activate humanitarian parole to evacuate as many people as possible. The challenge is, currently Congress has not adjusted their status. They still could, but they've not yet adjusted their status. And so humanitarian parolees from Afghanistan have 2 years to be here and get settled, and they have to apply for asylum within that 2 years.
Okay.
Now, Congress could adjust their status in the new year. That's still a possibility. But if their status is not, if their immigration status is not adjusted, they will have to apply for asylum.
So that actually answers my first follow-up, and I've got a second one, and then I want to go to Elizabeth, who's a member of our immigration task force, who has a question. So I guess it's sort of A and B. First, what percentage of asylum seekers actually get asylum?
We don't have active statistics because, to be honest, it was gutted under Donald Trump.
Yeah, that's true.
And we don't quite know that. I actually asked an immigration attorney that, and they said the numbers are still coming in, so to be determined.
Okay, and so because, say we get involved with neighbor to neighbor, and we work with an individual or a family who are, they have not been granted asylum. They're either parolee status or they're asylum seeker status. What happens if they go through the process and they're not granted asylum?
They're returned to their sending country.
Okay, and then we would have, I guess that's another whole range of decisions that we would have to make as a congregation with that family. About
exactly.
what we do about that. And so I'm going to jump over to Elizabeth. You want to introduce yourself and ask your question? Hold on. Just make sure it's turned on. We'll make sure it's turned on. You test it? I just run mine over.
Yes.
Yep, there you go.
Thank you for your work. This is heartbreaking, just utterly heartbreaking. The refugees right and left from so many countries. I have a question for you in regards to financial responsibilities, because if we were to take on a family, does that mean providing housing? I know that I'm involved with helping when families seeking asylum, and the legal costs, attorney costs, housing, they're working under the table because somehow they have to get, food or, children going to school, their needs. It's a pretty large financial responsibility, as well as all the other, support, emotional, spiritual, helping with English, on and on. But if you could speak to the financial implications of something of this sort.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So yes, we would ask the congregation to take on some of that financial burden. And so what the biggest challenge that we're finding is helping folks find rent, or, find places to rent, I should say. And so, especially in high rent areas like where I live in Seattle, or, Pasadena or Philadelphia, New York, et cetera, San Francisco, that's become a huge challenge. And so what we tend to do is invite congregations to try to find some happy medium. Contact the diocese, see if there's empty rectories, see if a landlord would be willing to give partial rent, like say, we'll charge 2/3 of what we usually would. But yes, we would ask the congregation to take on the financial responsibility. There's also ways to collect in-kind donations. So if there's a family, let's just say with 3 kids, making sure the kids are enrolled in school, making sure they have the clothes they need, the school supplies. And so those are things that we can, of course, do a collection for and stuff. And we're working, we just matched our first congregation. It's the Washington National Cathedral. And so we worked with them to come up with a budget that would sort of, help them understand how much they needed to fundraise. Their case is a little unique. So in a lot of ways, that budget wouldn't necessarily be reflective of other asylum seekers. But we would work with you guys to sort of figure out, like, okay, what do we need to fundraise? What are the financial requirements in order to do this? But generally, sort of imagine what you would need if you relocated to a new community, and that's what we're looking at.
Relocating to LA is not cheap. Go ahead, Elizabeth, follow up.
Yeah.
So that's housing. How about legal costs?
Good question.
Attorney fees, finding immigration attorney to assist them in the process. That's another huge burden.
Yep. So there are some pro bono attorneys that we've worked with. A lot of the Afghans that we have been working with are eligible for a unique program through a nationwide lawyers guild. So there are some ways to sort of get creative. And I think you're right to ask these questions, because these are the tough questions that we have to ask. So housing, basic ESL courses, transportation. We encourage always self-sufficiency, and so helping folks understand and navigate the public transportation system, or getting a car, so learning to drive, getting their license, etc. Those are all things that sort of the committee would help with. And sometimes we can get lucky and get a pro bono attorney. Other times we can't. And so yes, you're absolutely right. It is not an inexpensive operation.
Yeah. Thank you. Question just got texted in. How are language differences managed? Are translators available in every case?
So it depends on where folks are coming from. A lot of the Afghans we've been working with actually were translators for the U.S. government during the war. And so they, of course, would speak English. Sometimes the husband may speak English, but the wife doesn't, and the children don't. And so we would encourage ESL courses for the family to resettle, and then sort of piece resources together, right? There may be a local Afghan community that's willing to help with translation. We tend to take it on a case-by-case basis and sort of come up with resources. Of course, a more common language like Spanish is easier to find translators for, but generally we ask that the congregation take on those costs because our resources within EMM are so, especially within the church engagement unit, are so limited that we just don't have the ability to pay for translators.
Right. Another question. I did just a very, very small bit of work with Liberian refugees when I was in Ghana about 15 years ago. There was a Liberian refugee camp called Budaburam, and it was a UNHCR camp. And one of the things that I learned there, or actually sort of two, is first of all that almost everyone in that camp was suffering from significant trauma. I mean, they were fleeing Charles Taylor's regime in Liberia, but even just the whole process of being uprooted from your home, it's incredibly traumatic. And there were not anywhere near adequate resources for trauma-informed care for the refugees. And the people who worked with the refugees, were not trained in trauma, and there was no care for them for secondary trauma. And I'm wondering, as we look at the neighbor-to-neighbor program for congregations, is there an understanding that we're going to be working with families and people who are probably deeply traumatized, and how do we equip people in the congregation both to recognize that, for us to maybe connect people with care, but also how do we deal with the secondary trauma that's going to come from working with folks?
Absolutely, it's a great question, and you're absolutely right. The folks that we would be working with have enormous levels of trauma, oftentimes unrecognized, undiagnosed, and that comes out in all sorts of unique ways, right? As you probably saw in your work in Ghana. And so we have a 6-video series of training videos that we've been working to implement, and we're in the process of post-production, and we'll launch those videos hopefully in early February. This is sort of All Saints is getting the sort of sneak peek into neighbor to neighbor. We'll be doing these sort of launches or these conversations in a much larger way in a few months. But within those videos that I spoke about, there's 2 45-minute training videos about both trauma, sort of recognizing trauma, the ways it impacts individuals, and then secondary trauma that you spoke about, right? The ways in which we, as those who care for refugees or asylum seekers, oftentimes sort of take on that trauma because we're human, right? And our hearts connect to the hearts of folks who are suffering. And so that's one way, right? Sort of at least recognizing, okay, this is something that is happening. And then we also are engaging in a thing called communities of practice, where after you complete the training, we have monthly calls where there will be opportunities to sort of share about what's going on, what's working, what's not working, what are some of the challenges you're facing as, in this work of sponsoring a family. And then we would also have opportunities for continuing education. So psychologists coming in, immigration attorneys, to begin sort of discussing the ways in which trauma is impacting us, but also, hey, we have a question about our the neighbor we're working with. We don't know how to handle this particular piece of their immigration status or their immigration case. Can you get an immigration attorney? Yep, we're going to work on that. So, and throughout it all, I'm sort of the chaplain for all of these congregations. Wow. So as issues come up, whether they're big or small, I'm available so that the burden doesn't rest on the parish clergy or on staff, but that, you're there to support and to preach about it and to talk about it, but that my work is to support sort of crises and handle crises as they come up and support the committee in that work. So it's far from adequate, but it's a step towards that, answering your question, Mike.
So, and again, people can text in questions, and if you all have questions here, raise your hand, and Thomas will bring you a microphone. So just sort of on that, I always want to also look at what are some of the advocacy things that we can participate in.
Totally.
And clearly, are there legislative remedies to expand the definition of who can seek asylum, and also to expand perhaps the numbers of people who come in. But also I think within the church, so EMM's funding, you said a lot of it comes from the State Department. As I remember from way too long ago being a General Convention deputy, there is also funding that comes from the national church budget, I'm hoping. It feels like one of the first things we got to do is, as long as you're willing to do it, is to make your job a full-time job. Because when you talked about rolling out this program and you're serving as chaplain to all these congregations, trying to do that part-time sounds like just bananas to me. And so where are the places that we can advocate for more resources for EMM within the Episcopal Church, but also do you know of, or is this an Office of Government Relations question, is there legislative advocacy that is possible right now to help impact refugee resettlement?
Totally. So the biggest piece of legislation right now that we really need Congress to pass is the Afghan Adjustment Act, the AAA. And the reason for that is then if all these Afghans have to apply for asylum, we are going to have a huge backlog of cases. So the biggest need right now is to pass the Afghan Adjustment Act. And OGR, the Office of Government Relations, which you just mentioned, Mike, have a lot of resources and talking points that you can sort of use when you're calling your local congress member or your local senator to make sure that they know this is important. We know that it takes about 6 to 7 phone calls from local constituents before it sort of gets presented to that member of Congress or to that senator. So even if just 7 people who attended today picked up the phone and said, hey, we need to do this, that tends to get to the desk of the person who actually votes on it. So that would be a huge win. Mm-hmm. There are a number of other pending legislations that we need to get passed, but the AAA is the biggest one right now. And I do recommend, if anyone is able, to definitely apply for to sign up for the notices that come from OGR, because they'll oftentimes send action alerts and things that you can do from your home. The Office of Government Relations, OGR. So please definitely sign up for those, because we work closely with OGR to send those notices out whenever there's an opportunity for action. In terms of fundraising, we can always use resources within EMM. And the reason for that is that the State Department can't fund direct church work. Right. And so the State Department can fund the work of refugee resettlement, and there's all sorts of complex dynamics and stuff. But yes, if there is a desire and a willingness to sort of increase funding for EMM, both within General Convention as well as other mechanisms, please, probably best to talk to me offline so we can go through some of those logistics and navigate some of the complexities that go with it. But we would certainly welcome that opportunity.
That's great, thank you. Just sort of, some people are saying, OGR, what's that? The Office of Government Relations is really sort of the lobbying office of the Episcopal Church on Capitol Hill. They actually have an office that they call the God Box. They share it with the Methodists and the Lutherans, I think, they share it with. We do an action every week that the congregation can sign on to. A lot of them come from the Episcopal Office of Government Relations, and their suggestions of, here's something that we can advocate. In fact, most of the time, if you're being asked to write a letter to your member of Congress, a lot of that stuff is coming from the Episcopal Office of Government Relations. And it's a really effective way of the Episcopal Church to be politically active and to have a voice, because it can leverage Episcopalians in every congressional district in this country. And so that's why it is important that we take part in that. I don't know if you're aware, and again, I know your specialty is neighbor to neighbor, so it's okay to just say I have no idea, because I know I say that all the time. We have an organization here in the Episcopal Diocese of Los Angeles called IRIS, which is I think it's the Interfaith Resettlement, let me get it right here, Interfaith Refugee and Immigration Service. And so a lot of refugee resettlement is done through IRIS. Do you know if IRIS is affiliated with EMM, or what the relationship, do you know anything about that?
Yep, that's one of our 11 affiliates.
Okay, great. And so we have one directly here in the Diocese of Los Angeles. And so that's something that we know of. And Bishop Taylor is a huge proponent of IRIS, and All Saints has supported the work that IRIS has done. Elizabeth,
That's great.
Did you have something else?
Yeah, I'm just brainstorming, Chris. It sounds, somewhat inefficient to have, a congregation adopts one family, as opposed to, I was wondering, like we have an interfaith ministry, or to get a bunch of different churches where there could be created a community, let's say, of Afghan refugees, where there are 4 families at a time. And so resources, financial resources might be more effective, but also addressing the trauma piece, that there wouldn't be this family isolated in the boonies in some community, and there's, there would be families that have suffered similarly close by, or even, like an apartment complex where 4 families, or an apartment that's shared by 2 families, or is there a way to do it that would be more financially efficient, and families would feel more supported with similar families close by? Is there any model or any place something like that has been done?
So it's a great question. We certainly try our best to relocate Afghans wherever there is an already existing Afghan community. So that's part of it, right? So we kind of utilize that resource. And Afghans have been incredible in welcoming this new wave of folks coming, Afghans who are already here. What we would say is, what we found is that, All Saints Pasadena, of course, is a famous church and a church with a lot of membership. I served a small, tiny congregation of about, we had an average Sunday attendance around 20 or 25 people in Long Island. And so a church like that just could never do a lift like this of welcoming an asylum seeker. And so we would say, let's just say hypothetically, there was a church somewhere right close by to you that was 25 or 30 people on a Sunday, and they wanted to do this work. We have a whole database that we're working to build out, where I would sort of look and go, oh, hey, Mike, there's this other church down the street who also wants to help. Would you be willing to work with them? So I would say, I don't know Los Angeles, Pasadena super well. Sadly, I've only been to visit once. I did meet your bishop at the border conference that we had a few years ago in Arizona. He seems really committed to the cause, for which I'm grateful. I would say if there are congregations locally that are willing to work on this, let us know, and we can start sort of pooling those resources. But you're sort of the experts, right? You're on the ground and you know what congregations may be willing to help. And so I would say we'll lean on your wisdom. But we would love to do something collaborative like that, where we can train up a number of congregations to do this work.
And I would assume that we're not limited to working with Episcopal congregations. We have other congregations in the neighborhood. We have interfaith congregations that are partners.
Absolutely, yeah. We're willing to work with anybody.
That's fantastic. So any more questions from the room? Oh, Alice does. Can we get a mic over to Alice? And again, you can text your questions 910-TEXT-ASC, 910-839-8272. Alice, go ahead.
So real quick, my question is, because we don't know, there are so many needs that you listed, it's overwhelming. And you have congregations who want to help, but we don't know where to even begin. Is there a way that you have like a list of needs and how much time or resources it takes for each one, so that we can at least choose something, either just individually or from the church that we go to, or as interfaith, a bunch of churches, we can show it like a menu and you choose, this is the price for each one, or the amount of time or the resources that are needed. So we can start from there.
Yeah, so first things first, let me say I recognize how overwhelming it can be. And, that comes from someone who onboarded with a refugee resettlement agency in the perhaps the most insane time in the last 40 years. So I totally get it, right? And I've gotten used to it, and I have learned to sort of present it. But this is very overwhelming. It can be overbearing and hard to sort of make sense of it in our heads. And our hearts are called to the work, but our heads are like, how is this humanly possible? So if that's where you're at, you're human and you're normal. So it is very, very hard work and can be overwhelming. The challenge with what you're presenting, I completely understand the rationale for it. The challenge is that each family is so vastly different that there's no real way to have a menu or any sort of indication. Now, certainly, there's some basic needs, right? We have to get housing, legal, social services, wraparound. Some communities have those services that exist. But this is, the reason we do this work is because we believe as people of faith that God calls us to it and that God will open the doors. And so we'll begin conversations with you. So let's say that, in a few months, All Saints says, that guy, Chris McNabb, he had a crazy idea, but the Spirit's been stirring and we really feel like maybe this is something we want to do. Then we would start just having an initial conversation. And you could bring all the questions, right? And then in the training process, fast forwarding a bit, you would go through your community in a process called neighborhood mapping, and you'd map out all the different resources that already exist in your community. You may find, the local school district, they have an ESL program for kids. Okay, great. The local Methodist church, they have ESL, and the local Lutheran church has a food pantry. Okay, we're going to start making these things connect. So it's not that everything rests on the shoulders of that committee, but you're sort of coordinating the resources and making sure that things happen. But as I said, because each family is unique, it just depends on what is going on, what's happening in your community, what's happening with that particular family, and that's what makes something like a menu hard. I know that's not a good answer to your question, but I hope it helps at least calm a little fear.
And that actually makes me think that there's a lot greater potential for the neighbor-to-neighbor program, and we're going to have to wrap this up. I wish we could talk longer, is that, this will equip a congregation, say, like ours, to really be hospitable to immigrants of all sorts. Not just refugees and asylum seekers, people who are undocumented, people who have various different statuses, anyone who is coming in here without resources, that we would, this mapping work, that we would be ready to say, okay, we can, we have a process, because, we have people in this congregation, and that because we are known for being a peace and justice congregation and being a safe place, we're a sanctuary church, that if you are undocumented, that you can come to and it's safe. This feels like a really great way that we can train up ourselves to be hospitable across the board.
Absolutely, and that's the hope, is that this is just the beginning of a relationship, right? And I think that's the key word. It's relationship with EMM, neighbor to neighbor, All Saints, whatever congregation, and then ultimately building a relationship and a community between the congregation and the family that we would, you'd be sponsoring.
Great, thank you. Can we give Chris a hand? Thank you for you and all the work that you're doing. I don't know if you can hear the applause, but it's out there. And Thomas, do you want to say a few words about the network and how people can talk to you and contact you?
Sure, yeah. Chris, thank you so much for being with us this morning. And if you are interested about the Episcopal Migration Ministry Network meeting that meets monthly on the fourth Wednesday, am I getting that correct, Chris? I believe so. Third or fourth?
I think it's a third Wednesday.
Third Wednesday. Contact me, I can get you the information so you can join. It's a Zoom call that happens on a monthly basis, so let me know. And thank you again, Chris, for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you
all
for the
for being here.
invitation.
Thank you those who are joining us online. No forums the next 2 weeks because, like Christmas and New Year's, but we'll be back on, I believe it's the 9th of January, whatever that Sunday is. The 8th, we're going to have the memorial service for Rector Emeritus George Regas. It is going to be a huge event in the life of this community. And then on the 9th, a lot of people are coming in, we hope, Omicron permitting, for this service. We're going to have a great gathering of people current and past from All Saints Church to share stories about George. And that will be the forum. And then the week after that, Reverend Dr. Will Gaffney will be with us to update us on what's happening next with the Women's Lectionary. And then we're off to the races in 2022. So Chris, thank you so much for being here. Thanks, everybody. Great to have you here. Thanks, as always, Keith and Manny, for helping make this happen. See you all later. Bye. Thanks, Chris.